Alrighty guys, a very warm welcome again to another video. Today is just going to be a quick one, touching on a subject that I'm really interested in, which is the hormonal impact of anything involving stress, but particularly, in this context, endurance training and hormones. So if you're training for an Ironman, if you're training for a long distance cycling event, running event, swimming, this is a significant stress on the body, and hormones will react to stress regardless of what that stress is. It could be emotional, mental, psychological stress through hardship with, whether it's going through a difficult relationship or whether it's work-based stress. It could be stress in education. It could be any kind of financial stress. All of these mental stresses will also have very similar effects, but obviously physical stress will definitely impact the hormonal system significantly. So here's 5 key hormones, which, basic physiology. Essentially, we have our hypothalamus in the brain, we have our pituitary, and these essentially communicate with each other to modulate or regulate, is a better term, our baseline levels of hormones so that we're most in balance with what we're going through. So if you're going through an acute stressful phase, and that could be, for example, in this context, overtraining, increasing your volume, increasing your intensity, or just doing a whole lot of training that you'd normally do, but now you have a whole lot of other lifestyle stresses on the side, well, this is going to impact the stress hormones, which will then impact the sex steroids, the regenerative or reparative hormones, and also thyroid function. So when we're overtraining or training in excess, and just before we get into it, actually, this is why I don't love, but I'm a very strong advocate for getting baseline blood levels done of all of your micronutrients, all of your basic, health parameters. However, also, and that's including full blood count, hematocrit, hemoglobin, ferritin, B12, all that stuff. However, also looking at your hormones, because one thing that's often neglected, and not a lot of people, I guess, sometimes don't give it the respect or put enough emphasis on their hormonal health that it really deserves, because it can really affect, obviously, how you feel, your performance, your ability to recover, your mindset, and everything else. So number one's cortisol. So cortisol is an acute stress hormone. Similar thing with prolactin. So these will both increase generally. These are very general rules. These will both increase in terms of acute stress. And one of the things which prolactin in particular does is it suppresses testosterone, but cortisol also suppresses testosterone growth hormone and thyroid hormone output. It does this via various mechanisms, acting on the actual signaling hormones coming from the pituitary gland in the brain itself. So without getting too much into all the science behind that, what you need to look for with endurance training is that your cortisol isn't spiking too much. So if you get a morning cortisol test, so an AM cortisol blood reading, and you've doubled your cortisol from the last time you got one or before you started the training program, this could be an early indicator or a genuine indicator that you're overtraining quite significantly, or your body is kind of under a lot of stress. So just be aware of that. Same thing with prolactin. Testosterone, obviously very, very important for muscle recovery in terms of endurance training, the health of the heart, because testosterone converts to estrogen, and that's very cardioprotective, so protective of the heart and the blood vessels. And testosterone plays a very large role in mood, cognitive function, drive, motivation, and all that kind of stuff too. Not in terms of like acutely, like some other drugs that work more on like the dopamine and like the neurochemistry, but testosterone very much plays a baseline, like a very high level role in the baseline levels of motivation, drive, mood, general outlook, etc. So very important. So in the context of elevated stress, which is essentially what occurs during overtraining or endurance training in general, testosterone levels can deplete, and we see reduced testosterone levels, particularly in cyclists, but also in long distance runners and Ironman triathletes and all those kind of long distance, kind of slow, long training sports, when there isn't adequate recovery, but even just generally. So testosterone, very important, and you don't want this to be getting too depleted during a training block or during a preparation for a race, because that will, everyone will respond differently, but it can definitely impact your performance. Next one is growth hormone. So growth hormone's often not tested for in a blood test, so you're unlikely to go and test growth hormone directly. You really need to do this by a stimulation test or a stimulation test. That's the right word. However, you can kind of get a proxy measure of like your growth hormone levels, which is IGF-1. It's not the most accurate because it's influenced by other things apart from growth hormone, but it can give you a general level of like how much growth hormone you have overall. It's not always 100% diagnostic in terms of whether you have a deficiency or not, though. So growth hormone can be affected, but it's one of those ones where to actually test for it is quite complicated. So to summarize so far what we've got with endurance training, we'll generally see elevations in cortisol and prolactin. We'll generally see decreases in testosterone and growth hormone output, particularly in the context of overtraining. Obviously, if you're doing it and you're recovering sufficiently, your hormones shouldn't be impacted too much. And you can do other things to support your hormonal health, like eating enough calories, getting enough sleep, limiting stimulants later in the day, and reducing other stresses in your life as well, among other things, of course. And so the last one I've got on this list, which is very important to test, is thyroid hormone. Now, this will vary between different areas of the world, depending on where you are, different countries. Thyroid hormone in Australia, for example, if someone goes and gets their thyroid tested, they'll often only ever get tested TSH, generally. And the TSH is called thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is the signal hormone sent from the pituitary, so sent by the brain to the thyroid gland, which is located about here in the neck. The signal hormone will be elevated in terms of, like, if we can contextualize that, if you have an underactive thyroid, the brain is basically saying, the pituitary is saying, work harder. So TSH will be higher, which would indicate generally, if everything's operating as it should be, a underactive thyroid. If the thyroid's absolutely buzzing along and it's very active, TSH will actually be lower because the brain's saying, oh no, we've got plenty of thyroid hormone, which supports our basal metabolic rate and many other functions. Therefore, we don't need to be like constantly activating it or sending so much signal to say work, work, work. So TSH is a good measure. However, to get a true accurate representation of your actual thyroid hormone status, it's best often to get TSH alongside T4 and then free T3 particularly. Because the free T3 is like the active version of thyroid hormone. T4 is also a precursor hormone, which gets converted into T3 to then go ahead and do all the functions that thyroid hormone does in the body. Both are important though. So just be aware that if you go and get a blood test, and I guess why I'm saying this is because all of these hormones can affect all of the other ones, right? Nothing works in an isolation. The body's a whole complete system. Elevated cortisol, for example, can blunt the actual response that the pituitary gland in the brain has to activate the glands which produce these other hormones. So very highly chronic elevated stress and cortisol and prolactin will say to the brain, we're not going to actually pump out the hormones that increase testosterone, which are LH, FSH, but that doesn't really matter. We're not actually going to release more growth hormone, and we're not actually going to recognize so well that our thyroid may be underactive, and therefore on a blood test, the TSH level, which is kind of an indirect measure, remember we said will be elevated if it's all working well and your thyroid's underactive. When I say working well, I mean if the systems are actually recognizing a problem, and it'll be very low if the thyroid's overactive, and it'll be anywhere between generally 0.5 and 1.5 or 0.5 and 2 if your thyroid's in a really good state. However, cortisol and these stress hormones can really disrupt this whole process of recognizing an issue. So you can have a hypothyroid state where your thyroid hormones in your body aren't actually being pumped out as much as they should to support the demands. However, because cortisol is so high and everything's kind of being suppressed, the TSH also doesn't get increased, I guess, as a compensatory mechanism for that. So hopefully that made some kind of sense. But in general, what you really want to be doing, okay, if you're starting a training program, before you start, get your bloods, get your baseline levels of hormones, monitor how you feel, and then somewhere in the middle of your training block, just go get another hormone panel if you can, if it's feasible, or if you're having some symptoms of, low libido, reduced drive, motivation, fatigue, all that kind of stuff. Because the last thing you want is to work yourself into a state of overtraining and fatigue, whereby your stress hormones are through the roof chronically. Your repair hormones, so testosterone, growth hormone, are right down. And then your hormone, which really supports your whole basal metabolic rate and system, thyroid hormone, is also kind of getting hit for 6 as well. So there's 5 really important ones to monitor. There are other things, but from a hormone perspective, I'd say these are kind of the highest yield. And in terms of getting blood tests, at least the 4 of cortisol, prolactin, testosterone, and thyroid hormone at a minimum. If you can monitor those and just kind of see the trends and whether you're objectively getting into overtraining territory, that's always going to be better than just relying purely on your subjective experience. But that can tell you a lot too. So hopefully that was informative and helpful. Post any questions below regarding this stuff. I understand it's a very complicated topic when we talk about different physiology of how it all works. But nonetheless, from an overall perspective, I think that's a general kind of basic list of, what you kind of should be worrying about. Well, not worrying, but generally observing and tracking if you can, just to give yourself an objective measure as to the impact of the training rather than just how you're actually feeling. So hopefully that was good, or hopefully that was helpful for some people. And post any questions below. Take care, guys, and I will see you in the next video.